If you enjoy this video, please consider joining my Patreon community. YouTube only allows big channels to be monetized, so I don't make any money from these videos unless listeners support me directly. But there are a few perks for doing that, a few extra videos, free books. It just happens that I recently wrote a small book about Urien and Rheged, which you can buy on my website. The Patreon link and the one for the book are just below this video. This is a bit of a departure from my usual mythology and folklore videos, but the story of Urien is close to my heart, and I noticed that there's hardly anything about him on YouTube, so here we are. I lived in Edinburgh for many years and frequently travelled to Cumbria and the borders. Increasingly, I have found myself drawn to what little we know of the Old North, Hen Ogledd, to the gods who were once worshipped there, the special problems created for the Britons by Hadrian's Wall, and of course, the poems of Taliesin. The men of Cattraeth arise at dawn to join the mighty cattle raider. Urien he is, their far-famed leader. It isn't easy to find a good narrative about Urien of Rheged because not much evidence survives from northern Britain in the 6th century. What I'm offering in this video comes from poetry, some of it contemporary with Urien's life, from the Welsh triads and other early texts, and from the 9th century monk historian Nennius. Which parts are true in the sense of historical fact is impossible to say, but the picture we are left with is surprisingly cohesive and important in its own right. While it's true that the bards and scribes will have embroidered stories to suit their own needs, the same can be said of historians. But at least the Welsh bards took the trouble to preserve Urien's story, so perhaps we should listen to what they have to say. I'm surprised that Urien is not more widely recognized as a great hero of the Celtic Britons in the way that Arthur and Boudicca are, for example, or the way Vercingetorix is remembered in what is now France. Before the Romans occupied Britain, the whole island was Brythonic-speaking. That is, everyone's language was closely related to the modern Welsh language. The Picts of northern Scotland are a mystery in many ways, but based on a few surviving names and place names, it looks like even they spoke a related language. How different the Picts really were from other Britons before the Romans singled them out as some kind of savages is hard to say. Building a big wall and telling them they mustn't cross it will surely have deepened divisions. At the same time, the wall created a special zone with its own subculture, which probably still has echoes today. Urien's home territory, or kingdom, was called Rheged, and the first problem is that we really don't know its exact location, or how big it was. The shaded area on this map shows the largest likely extent of it, but it may have only been either north or south of the Solway. The borders could have been constantly changing. If you're looking for some familiar landmarks on this map, Llywarch in the northwest is modern-day Dumbarton, not too far from Glasgow. Andine Aden in the northeast is Edinburgh. Near the bottom of the map, Elmet is the area around what is now Leeds, and just above it, to the east, Ebraich, called Efrog in modern Welsh, is the place now called York. It's likely that Urien had a fortress at Caerleil, modern-day Carlisle, and he is also described as a lord of Cattraeth, which is probably modern-day Catterick. Another place mentioned by the bards, called Llywelyn, is thought to be along the river now called Llefynyt. It may have been near modern-day Crosby Ravensworth, and it may have functioned more as a private residence than a fortress or garrison. There are some tantalizing ruins, but nothing conclusive. Urien was also known as the Lord of Erechwydd, a word relating to fresh water. But there is a lot of water in Cumbria and nowhere which has a similar name. That one remains a mystery. According to early genealogies, Urien was descended from a line of rulers who traced their ancestry back to a North British king called Hen. Yes, old King Cole. Urien's father was Cynfarch Mercian. Little is known of him except that he had a brother called Elidir. Cynfarch and Elidir, so the story goes, married women who were sisters, making their offspring double first cousins. You get a bonus point if you still remember this when it comes up again. According to the Welsh triads, Cynfarch's wife, Owain, gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. The boy was Urien, the girl was called Evrithel. Evrithel herself is an interesting character. She was the second wife of Elifir Gosgorthvawr, the ruler of Ebrei, or York. According to the same triad, she bore triplets, 2 sons called Gurgi and Peredur, and a daughter Ceindrich, of whom we hear no more. Gurgi and Peredur, however, went on to be famous warriors. But back to Urien. This is where the story takes an interesting turn. Still according to this same triad, and backed up by a 16th century source, there is a story about how Urien encountered a mysterious woman washing garments at a ford. He had sex with her, after which she identified herself as Modron, the daughter of Afallach, the king of Annuvin. She told him that she was fated to wash at the ford until he turned up and got her pregnant. Modron instructed Urien to return to the ford in a year's time, and she would give him their son. In the event, she presented him with twins, a daughter Morvith and a son Owain, both of whom appear to have been real people, even if we doubt their birth legend. For those of you not up on Welsh myths, I'll just explain that Modron means great or divine mother, and she may have been worshipped as a deity in the region at one time. Annuvin, of course, is the name for the Brythonic otherworld, while the name Afallach relates to apples, which are often associated with the otherworld in Celtic myth. Cumbria has a number of legends concerning a so-called fairy king called Afallach. Many of these stories center around Ravenglass and its ruined Roman baths, and around Hardknot Pass, where there are also some very striking ruins. It's likely that the goddess Modron, and this story in particular, is the origin of the character Morgan le Fay in later Arthurian literature. It may seem that we've digressed from Urien's story, but let's just recap on these births. According to the triads, Urien was the product of a multiple birth, with both he and his twin sister moving into positions of high rank. His sister, now the Queen of York, bears triplets, including famous twin sons. Finally, Urien himself fathers twins by something like divine means. It could just be that twins ran in his family, or it's possible that the Celtic association between twins and the birth of heroes is at work here. In that case, it would be another indication of the high esteem in which Urien of Rheged was held by the poets and storytellers. The main contemporary source we have for information about Urien is the poet Taliesin. In spite of the magical legends surrounding him, there is good evidence that Taliesin was a real person, and that a small number of poems in the Book of Taliesin were composed by him, as he was indeed Urien's court poet for some time. Taliesin is mentioned in a list of 5 great northern poets in Nennius's Historia Brittonum. The work of a 6th century court poet was essentially to say how great his king was, with about equal emphasis on his might in battle and his generosity to his people. Taliesin's poetry fulfills these duties so well that it feels as if there was genuine affection and admiration there. Urien Rheged, virtuous nobleman, with an open hand you care for your people. As you gather in, so you distribute. Bards of Britain, rejoice in your being. Great our joy in the sons of Urien, the greatest of kings, highest chieftain, renowned refuge, swift-handed protector. I'm betting that Taliesin was present during Urien's middle years. Urien seems to have had a long life, although we don't have secure dates for his birth or death. A couple of Taliesin's poems refer to Urien as grey-haired. bloodied men at the ford laid their swords at the feet of the grey-haired king. Destroyers of the land were brought low, their garments red with gore. He was battle-ready, resolute, a steady shelter, never fleeing. Rheged's lord, wondrous is his daring. These poems describe a time when Urien's son Owain is already an adult. One of these describes a military victory in which father and son defeat a foe thought to be the Anglian king Theodoric. Before the elm wood I saw many slain, crows crimson with carrion, as our men marched home. It will take a year to sing of our victory. Another of Taliesin's famous poems is an elegy for Owain's death. The soul of Owain, son of Urien, may God watch over him, Prince of Rheged, deep his grave. His deeds bring deepest praise, under turf with honour lain, his spear like the flight of dawn. He took the life of Flamdhun with ease, as one might fall asleep. However, there's no elegy for Urien in Taliesin's work, suggesting that Taliesin was either dead himself or no longer associated with Urien's court for some reason when Urien died. This also makes me think that Urien outlived Owain, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Urien's eldest son Owain is a legendary hero in his own right, remembered as a great warrior and leader and a generous friend to his comrades. Again, there is quite a lot of folklore about him, both in Cumbria and in Wales. In many ways he is more famous than Urien, although some of that is down to his name being used by later writers of Arthurian romances. Urien had a number of other sons who also played important parts in his story and the history of the times. We will look at them a little later. One story which doesn't turn up in the romances is that Owain was the father of St. Kentigern, also known as St. Mungo, who founded Glasgow Cathedral. There are at least two different versions of the conception of Kentigern, and the biographies of early saints are hardly trustworthy as works of history. However, the story goes that Owain courted Kentigern's mother, but she was extremely devout and wished to remain a virgin. When Owain grew tired of her refusal to marry him, he tricked her into a very brief sexual encounter, and the result was Kentigern. While we're on the subject of the church, this seems like a good time to have a look at what the historian we know as Nennius has to say about Urien. The passage is fairly brief, but very significant. Unfortunately, Nennius's Latin grammar seems to be less than perfect here, leaving his words open to a variety of interpretations. Now, Nennius was supposedly a 9th century monk based in North Wales. He is generally credited with writing the Historia Brittonum, or History of Britain. These are his words on the life and death of Urien. Hussa reigned 7 years. Against him fought 4 kings, Urien and Rhederthin and Goallach and Morcant. Theodoric fought bravely together with his sons against that Urien. But at that time sometimes the enemy and sometimes our countrymen were defeated, and he shut them up 3 days and 3 nights in the island of Metkite. And while he was on an expedition he was murdered at the instance of Morcant out of envy, because he possessed so much superiority over all the kings in military science. Let's unpick that just a little. Theodoric, son of Ida, is generally thought to be Flamdhun, who was mentioned as having been slain by Owain in Taliesin's poems. Flamdhun, meaning flame-bearer, was probably what the Britons called him, perhaps because he was burning their farms. So it was possibly Hussa that Urien fought in his final battle. From the rest of the passage, a great deal of information about Urien has been inferred by modern historians, and it generally goes something like this. Urien was making it his business to push the Angles out of Brynaich, or Bernicia, as the Angles called it, in order to stop their raids and settlements of the north. He was probably acquiring territory from other kingdoms where he could, as part of that campaign, either by creating client kingdoms or through direct conquest. At the same time, he was making alliances with other major rulers in the north to further this end. Nennius Rhederthin is surely Rheged of Alt Clead, who controlled the area around the River Clyde. Gwalach is Gwathach, who seems to be associated with the more southerly Elmet, the area around modern-day Leeds. Morcant or Morgan is an important player in this story, but the location of his power base is uncertain. It might have been to the south of modern-day East Lothian. If Nennius' story is correct, the British forces must have taken the Angles' stronghold of Bamborough, then known as Dingeardi, and driven the Angles into the sea. However, they took refuge on the island of Metkite, which is now known as Lindisfarne, or Holy Island. Now this was before the days of the famous Abbey of Lindisfarne. At this time there was only a fortress there. Lindisfarne itself is a tidal island, accessible on foot or horseback at low tide. It's unclear whether the Angles or the Britons had any ships to speak of at this battle, but it must have made for an extremely difficult and frustrating siege for the Britons to maintain. The situation was probably ripe for suspicion and treachery. Perhaps Morcant feared that once the victory was secured, his lands would also fall to Urien. The Triads take up the story, telling us that Morgan had Urien assassinated by one Llywelyn Llawdifro at a place called Aberllay. This is thought to refer to a small river mouth on the beach between Bamborough and Holy Island, which is now known as Ross Low. Sad is Evrithel on this night. A host mourns with her. Her brother is slain in Aberllay. We don't know whether the siege of Metkite was a military success for the Britons, or whether the Angles fought their way out. But either way, it didn't turn out to be the decisive defeat of the Angles that Urien must have hoped for. With Urien dead, the alliance between the other three crumbled, and within a generation the north was largely controlled by the Angles, who quickly retook both Dingeardi and Catraeth, which had been in Urien's hands. There are a few loose ends that we could usefully tie up. They are mostly literary, but they seem to reflect history, even if the dates and facts are missing. Personally, I'll take anything I can get when it comes to what happened in 6th century North Britain. Most important are the so-called Llywarch Hen poems. These deal with the immediate aftermath of Urien's death. Now, Llywarch Hen was one of those double first cousins of Urien that I mentioned earlier. These poems are told in the first person, in the voice of Llywarch. However, they were probably written in the 12th century by a poet simply writing in Llywarch's voice. Writing in the persona of an earlier poet is a common device in the Welsh bardic tradition. What we don't know is whether these poems reflect earlier poetry, which might have described actual events. However, they relate a horrific scenario in which Llywarch is charged with cutting off Urien's head, after he died, we hope, and carrying it somewhere where we assume it would be safe from becoming a trophy for the Angles. I bear the head of Kinvarch's son, who would stand without fear between two armies. I bear in my hand the head of the shepherd of Rheged, spear-spender, great-hearted. I bear on my left his head. He is left to the grave's refuge, who was once a refuge for the aged. There are loads of unanswered questions around this, partly because the poem goes on to describe the burial of Urien's body, but Celticist Patrick Sims-Williams throws a bit of light on it by mentioning that a couple of Irish high crosses bear carvings of similar scenes, where a headless body is being transported in a funeral procession, with the head being carried separately by a mourner. Who knows what was going on? The same group of poems goes on to mention how two of Urien's sons, Pasken and Elfin, went in pursuit of their father's murderer, although we don't know whether they caught him. It also suggests that there may have been some kind of history between Urien and his assassin. The ultimate ruin of Urien's stronghold is described. and Llywarch finds himself in difficulty, given shelter for a time by another of Urien's sons, Hen, before finally fleeing to Wales. Llywarch's own story certainly reflects what must have happened to many of the British nobility as the Angles took over. This hearth, hidden under thorns, knew once the gentle customs of Rheged's great generosity. This hearth, disturbed by hens, hunger never visited it when Owain and Urien were here. The other famous poem worth mentioning here is the Gododdin. This appears to be a genuine work of the early 7th century poet Aneurin. It describes how Mynyddaug Mwynfawr made gifts of gold and feasted men for a year before he led a large force from Edinburgh in an attempt to once again take Catraeth for the Britons. Men went to Catraeth at dawn. Their own keenness cut them down. Before they were grey, they were slain. Some 300 of the Gododdin were slaughtered, with perhaps 4 survivors, one of whom was the poet Aneurin, who wrote the elegies which make up the bulk of the poem. Fame the men going to Catraeth, their payment drunk from gold cups, for a whole year according to custom, gold torqued, 363 who rushed from that feasting of mead. From that fierce fighting escaped but 3, Cunnan and 2 of Iron's mighty, and I, who paid with my blood to make poetry. Aneurin goes on to tell how he was saved by one of Llywarch's sons. No man on earth, no mother's son, more comely in armour of iron, mighty his sword work and brave, who saved me from a bitter grave, surrounded by enemies' slaughter, fierce, fearless Kenai ap Llywarch. Another survivor was Cunnan ap Clydno, the husband of Urien's daughter, Morved, who was Owain's twin sister. Aneurin wrote of him, lasting the hall of Cunnan, bejewelled the breast of the generous lord, seated in splendour at the feast, very sure his striking, very sharp his spears, very white his shield, very swift his stallions sweeping into the fray, ferocious his blades in battle fury, at dawn the attack of Cunnan. What of Urien's sons? Pasken, probably the eldest after Owain, may have gone to Wales, like many men of the north. He is said to figure in various noble genealogies there. Another son, Careth, entered the church and went to Bardsey Island. He became Saint Careth, apparently founding a church on Bardsey, and perhaps another at Llangareth. Hen also entered the church, and Nennius tells us that he was engaged 40 days in baptizing all classes of the Saxons, and by his preaching many believed in Christ. It's possible that the reason Nennius knows so much about Hen is that Hen himself had produced a written account of the events, which Nennius had access to. Some time before he gained the throne, Oswy of Northumbria married Hen's granddaughter, Rheinvelth. Whatever shreds of Brythonic Rheged may have been left were probably absorbed into the new dynasty at that point. You might have a few questions about how either the historical King Arthur or the later Arthurian romances fit into all of this. If, as many believe, Arthur was a northern warlord, that would have been a generation or 2 before Urien, so they didn't meet. You may remember a King Uriens of Gore and an Owain from some Arthurian romances, but these stories were composed much later. The first authors of these simply grabbed famous names and created new characters, sometimes splicing in a bit of historical or legendary material to make their own tales seem more real. The first writer of an Arthurian saga, Geoffrey of Monmouth, gives his Uriens a wife called Morgan. He associates her with the Isle of Apples, or Avalon, in his Vita Merlini. This points directly to the story of Modron, the daughter of Afallach in the Welsh material. Geoffrey's stories were soon taken up by Chrétien de Troyes and reworked as French verse. Chrétien also has his Urien's character marrying Morgan le Fay, now cast as the sister of Arthur, and they have a son, Owain, whose name is obviously based on Owain. Both Chrétien and Thomas Malory portray this Morgan as a supernatural femme fatale. Later, when Chretian's unfinished Parsifal is reclaimed by the Welsh storytellers, he becomes Peredur, son of Efrog. This ties him in name to the probably historical Peredur, nephew of Urien, whose father was, indeed, the ruler of Ebraich, or York. But Peredur's story is a tangled one. I'll have to save that for another time. What I notice, though, is how the later stories of Arthur reflect the story of Urien himself. It's not clear exactly when the early Britons begin to tell stories of Arthur. That probably depends on what the historical reality of Arthur is, and there's no broad agreement about that. I'm not suggesting that Urien was Arthur either, rather that the idea of the aged king, who unites the Britons against foreign invaders, but who dies tragically just as victory is in sight, followed by the disintegration of the British alliance, is a seductive one. Thanks to the popularity of Taliesin's poetry and the later Llywarch poems, Urien became a focus for the lost glory of not only the North, but of the Brythonic world more generally. Arthur may have also begun as a hero of the North, but Geoffrey of Monmouth essentially presented him as an English hero, just as Geoffrey himself, although associated with Wales, was largely English in his own outlook. England, as the ascendant power, not surprisingly gathered parts of Urien's story and applied it to Arthur, whose own story was probably less well preserved at the time, if it was preserved at all. I began by saying that it's a shame that Urien has no memorial, and I stand by that. Urien is not an English hero, and he's not really a Welsh hero either. He's a hero of the North, a region which has never really lost its identity despite the imposition of borders and the loss of the Cumbric language. Perhaps it's time for the North to remember Urien as their own.